Good evening. My name is Gautam Ranji. I'm a Senior Vice President here at the Hearst Corporation. I'll be brief. I really just wanted to take the opportunity to welcome all of you here this evening. For those of you who have been at the Hearst Corporation before, welcome back. We have a fantastic program ahead this evening, and I will turn it over to Dr. Hugh Rome from Scholastic to begin the event.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I want to just reiterate that this is the David Hamburg lecture from the Carnegie Corporation, and David is here. We're so fortunate. David, in the front row, has made a significant contribution to some of the issues that Senator Sam Nunn's going to talk about this evening, but very significantly was chairman of the Department of Psychiatry at Stanford for many years, where he went on to become a trustee and has been involved in innumerable issues related to the thinking and mindset that affects the issues that we'll talk about tonight. I also would like to thank Vartan Gregorian for coming, representing also the Carnegie Corporation, and it's wonderful to have you here and to have this lecture. Now, the lecture will be given by Senator Sam Nunn, and it's almost impossible to introduce him because he has innumerable accolades, so I'm going to be really concise. I think, importantly at the moment, Senator Nunn, who was a U.S. Senator from 72 to 97, is currently CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative, NTI. There he's doing critical work in dealing with nuclear arms, as you may know, and related to that during his tenure in office, the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Plan, in my personal opinion, is one of the most significant things that the United States has achieved in the post-Soviet era. This took probably 7,600 or more nuclear weapons out of the Soviet Union. The weapons were then dismantled, and remarkably, the nuclear material used for power generation. A wonderful scenario. It took great vision, it took great energy, and it also took an ability to work across the aisle, and I think that is equally one of the hallmarks of Sam Nunn. I'll go back to the very beginning, hailing from Georgia, a family also in politics, an Eagle Scout, attended Georgia Tech, and then finished at Amory, but going back to Georgia Tech now, where there's the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. Among his innumerable achievements, he was asked by President Clinton to try to convince the Haitian dictator, General Raul Cedras, to leave, and he and a delegation with Colin Powell, former President Jimmy Carter, went in and were successful in that all-critical endeavor. He's on the board of places like Coca-Cola and many others, but I will also note just two of his truly innumerable accolades. He's the winner of the Ivan Allen Jr. Prize for Social Courage. How appropriate. And he is a Knight Commander of the Order of Merit of the Federal Republic of Germany. Again, makes great sense in terms of the impact that his work, particularly in nuclear arms, has had in Germany. 2 weeks ago, Sam Nunn gave a speech at the Carnegie Moscow Center, and I'll just quote a couple of things from that. Our challenges are clear and dangerous, he said. There is a corrosive lack of trust undermining cooperation between the U.S. and Russian leaders. There is aggressive rhetoric regarding nuclear weapons. And third, there is no agreed process or an agenda for next steps on nuclear arms control and risk reduction. So with that, no one's more articulate on these issues. Sam Nunn, in one of the many, many videos you can watch on him, did a description of if the 9/11 strike had been a nuclear weapon instead of these airplanes. As horrific as it is unimaginable, the consequences. So to understand the threat that nuclear arms are to our world is truly important. And this man is crusading. He's speaking every day to audiences such as ours tonight, and no one has a louder or more important voice on these issues. So with that, Senator Sam Nunn.
Thank you very much, Hugh, for that very generous introduction. And I thank Noel and the Foreign Policy Association not only for having this event today, but also for continuing your mission of informing and educating and discussing our foreign policy with so many citizens that really can have an impact on a smart and wise foreign policy for America. Never has there been a time where we needed more of that kind of discussion, because we were accustomed to a world that had good guys and bad guys, Soviet Union, the West, for many, many, many years, at least in perception. And now we're in a complex world with an awful lot of moving parts. So those kinds of discussions sponsored by your association is terrific, Noel and Hugh and all of those who make it possible. And I thank Carnegie. I see my good friend Vartan Gregorian here, and I see other Carnegie people who are so important, Deanna and Jean and others who work so hard to make the world safer every day. So I thank you for your continuing outstanding leadership. You know, having been in politics for 24 years, actually 28 counting the state legislature, I could explain to this audience today in a very brief time the intricacies and reasons behind all the political events this year. But I think I'm going to refrain from doing that by simply quoting Will Rogers many years ago, who seems to have no end to his relevancy of his remarks. He said that politicians are like diapers. They have to be changed often and for the same reason. So that is the end of my political report, and I'm going to spend the evening talking about serious matters that David Hamburg has played such a role in. So I'm delighted to be here this evening to honor the legacy and the work and the outstanding leadership, which continues, of Dr. David Hamburg on conflict prevention, among many other things. David and Betty Hamburg, who is not with us today, but David and Betty's lovely granddaughter is here, and they are at the top of my list of the country's most thoughtful and caring and accomplished and creative couples. And I consider them to be national treasures. For decades, they've worked to solve problems, to improve the prospects for humanity, and to prevent deadly conflict in the case of David. I've been honored to work closely with David Hamburg for many years and to benefit from his experience, from his wisdom, and from his marvelous spirit. I'm also delighted that David is spending some time when he has time, in our office in Washington, D.C., of the organization I run, which is called the Nuclear Threat Initiative. His insights and his experience is a thrill for our young staff and for indeed our older staff, all levels, every single day. Some people ask, well, where did you meet David Hamburg and how has he been so impactful? Let me flash back to September of 1991. I had recently returned from an exciting and fascinating, but rather alarming in many ways, trip to Moscow, just days after Gorbachev was released from the coup attempted by members of his own government and the Russian military. And the reason I had gone to Moscow was because one of the former Soviet friends that I had rushed from Budapest, Hungary, where I was in a conference, back to Moscow when Gorbachev was taken prisoner. And after he was released, he called me and said, Sam, immediately, you've got to come to Moscow. Things are really changing. He said, I will. I said, I don't have a visa. His name is Andrei Kukoshin. I don't have a visa. He said, I'll have the Russian ambassador there in just a few minutes. And I said, well, I noted the word Russian. I said, that's interesting to myself. But I said to him, Andrei, you've never done anything in your bureaucracy in less than 10 or 15 days, but I'll believe it when I see it. Anyway, the Russian or Soviet ambassador showed up, and I had a visa, and so I went. And I was convinced after several days there, watching all the turmoil and the excitement, I was convinced the Soviet Union was coming apart and that the largest arsenal of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons and materials in human history could be up for grabs across 11 time zones. That was the alarming part. Shortly thereafter, after I came back, Dick Lugar and I joined together to work on what some immediately termed a wacky idea, to spend U.S. defense dollars to secure and help destroy Soviet weapons of mass destruction, which were located in the far reaches of the Soviet Union. We argued that the United States must work with our Cold War adversary to protect the world from disaster if and when the empire broke up. This argument came in September. I was chair of the Armed Services Committee, and we had already passed our bill, and it went into conference, and Les Aspin, who was chair on the House side, and I put in that provision, what was later known as the Nunn-Lugar bill, and we put it in conference, and it came back to the Senate floor, and all heck broke loose, so to speak. So we had to pull it out and start convincing our colleagues over the next 6 to 8 weeks that it really was meritorious. Some of our Senate colleagues immediately criticized this effort as aid to the Soviet military, and the idea was initially in trouble, but under David Hamburg's leadership, the Carnegie Corporation, and I did not know this at that time, but they had recently funded a crucial report on the imminent danger of to the United States and the world from the possible loss of Soviet nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. This Carnegie report and its author, by the name of Ash Carter, who happens to be U.S. Secretary of Defense today, that made all the difference because it helped Senator Lugar and I. We had one breakfast after another, one lunch after another, convince our colleagues on an analytical basis. Mine was all intuitive. This was an analytical product that there really was an immediate danger to the United States and indeed to the whole world with the possible loss of control of Soviet nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. This Carnegie report made all the difference. In mid-December, the Senate approved the Nunn-Lugar amendment by 86 to 8, an amendment to the appropriation bill. 2 weeks later, President Bush signed the bill into law. 2 weeks after that, the Soviet Union collapsed. Not for the first time or the last, the role of Carnegie and the role of David Hamburg was indispensable, and this role continues today, and Carnegie under the very strong leadership of Vartan Gregorian. I've encountered and worked with many brilliant leaders in my years in the public arena. Some have great breadth on a range of diverse topics, and some have great range in terms of breadth in areas of specialty. My bottom line, I've never known anyone that could match David's breadth of experience and his depth of knowledge and his huge heart to go with it. What a combination. Thank you, David. I salute you for your sterling work, and that work continues. You are crown jewel. Years ago, some young person came up to then Secretary of State Dean Acheson and asked the Secretary how he would describe foreign policy. Evidently, there had been a particularly bad week for Secretary Acheson. He thought for 10 or 15 seconds, scratched his head, and finally said, "Foreign policy is one damn thing after another." Well, there's a lot of truth to that, and it's even more true today because we have so many crises going on in the world and so many moving parts. You know, it's important to sort out priorities, and it's absolutely crucial the United States sort out priorities because we are actually expected and asked to be everywhere to deal in every crisis, and it is impossible. So we have to set priorities. Many things are important. Many things are important. Many things we can justify getting involved. That doesn't mean they're wise. A few things are vital. A very few are what I call existential. Einstein said many years ago something to this effect: "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but I am confident that World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. I think that tells us something about what's vital and what's existential. Beginning in 2006, George Shultz, Bill Perry, Henry Kissinger, and I have discussed the dangers relating to nuclear weapons and our continuing obligation as a nation to address these risks. Since that time, we've authored 5 essays in the Wall Street Journal detailing our conclusions and their implication. And believe me, with the 4 of us, every essay is a negotiated product. It takes quite a while to put together. But let me reduce all 5 of these down to 3 key points. First, we are in a new and dangerous era, nuclear era, with outdated nuclear policies and increasing risk of nuclear use. Second, in this new era of 9 armed nations and others aspiring to that ambition, reliance on nuclear weapons for security is becoming increasingly hazardous and decreasingly effective as a deterrent to prevent war. Third, U.S. leadership and new approaches are required to protect our security. We need to take practical steps with other nations to reduce risk now and build the essential foundation to ultimately end nuclear weapons as a threat to the world. In our 5 essays, we outline a series of steps urgently needed today, as well as the long-term vision of ultimately getting rid of nuclear weapons in the world. This policy framework was initially adopted by both the Republican, John McCain, and Democratic candidate for president in 2008. Of course, that was President Obama. And in 2009, President Obama, in his Prague speech, as well as the UN Security Council later that year, by unanimous vote, including Russia, China, France, the UK, and the US, called for steps to make this world safer for all and to create the conditions for a world without nuclear weapons. This was encouraging. Of course, that principle is already in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's been there for a long time. But having it said again in this day and time by these leaders in the UN Security Council was encouraging. If, however, we look at what has been accomplished over the past decade, the report card is much more mixed. On the plus side, in some areas, progress has been made in reducing nuclear dangers and advancing non-proliferation through the hard work of many governments. The New START agreement provides a new and legally binding framework for reductions and, most importantly, verification of U.S. and Russian strategic nuclear forces, an essential component of strategic stability. Also on the plus side, the nuclear security summits led by President Obama have contributed to a significant reduction in the number of countries with weapons-usable nuclear materials that could be used to build nuclear bombs. And the further good news is we've gone from 50 countries to 24 countries in the last 25 years that have weapons-usable nuclear material. Not weapons, but weapons-usable nuclear material, which is what terrorists would like to have in order to build a crude weapon to blow up a city somewhere in the world. The nuclear agreement with Iran is a significant step forward in preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon and a cascade of probable nuclear proliferation in the Middle East that would follow. It is certainly not a permanent guarantee. It buys time, and time is valuable in this arena. It buys time if it is successfully implemented, and that will take a lot of diligence by the United States and other countries. But despite these encouraging accomplishments, progress on many essential steps is halting or is absent. In particular, the United States and Russia nuclear cuts are stalled, and other nuclear nations are reluctant to join into arms control, even discussions, pointing out that U.S. and Russia still control 90% of global nuclear inventory, which is true. The U.S. and Russia still deploy thousands of nuclear weapons ready to launch on a moment's notice, something that has been bothering me for many, many years, increasing the risk of a catastrophic accident or miscalculation based on false warning. And in a cyber world, false warning becomes much more likely. Hundreds of U.S. and thousands of Russian short-range nuclear weapons inviting targets for terrorists remain deployed or stored in Europe, all of them dangerous if not properly guarded, and secured. The comprehensive treaty banning nuclear tests remains unratified by a number of nations, including the United States. Nearly 2,000 metric tons of highly enriched uranium and plutonium are spread across facilities in the 24 countries that still have that material, and there is no global system for tracking, accounting for, and managing and securing these materials, including materials under military control, which is 83% of the total. The good news is, as we move to the final Nuclear Security Conference, which will be coming up in 1 week under President Obama's leadership, is that we have moved from 32 countries to 24 countries retaining weapons-usable material over the last 6 years. So there's a huge job ahead. The job is just beginning. The terrorist threat is getting worse in the sense of groups that would not only aspire to such nuclear materials, but also would use them if they have an opportunity. So we have a lot to do, and sustaining that progress is vital for our country and the world. Clearly, the pace of work on these critical risk reduction steps does not match the urgency of the global threat. The world's efforts remain inadequate to the danger. Now, in terms of looking at the broader picture of what's going on in the world, and many of you are more expertise in many of these areas than I am, but compounding these dangers, we have Russia's annexation of Crimea and support for separatists, and that's violation of its commitments to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in the 1990s, which is part of the program that Hugh referred to in his introduction. We had 3 countries give up their nuclear weapons altogether: Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. A huge, huge deal that went largely unnoticed, but was tremendously important for our security and the security of the region. You can figure what kind of situation it would be there now if all 3 of those countries still had thousands of nuclear weapons. And Ukraine had the largest nuclear inventory of weapons aimed at the United States of any countries except Russia and perhaps China. Washington believes that Moscow is violating the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, and Russia has charges against the U.S. of violations themselves. European Union countries are facing new security challenges generated by the Syrian tragedy and open borders, as well as the Eurozone having other struggles, including the Greece financial crisis, though Eurozone is having a real struggle. Islamic State extremists are threatening states and borders in pursuit of a caliphate stretching across the Middle East. They are now claiming a dirty bomb capability. There are doubters as to whether that's true or not, but anytime you control territory and you have access to hospitals, hospitals have radiological material. This is not weapon-grade material, but it could be the subject of a dirty bomb. So it's a serious problem. Tensions between China and other nations in Asia, including U.S. friends and allies, undermine regional stability in that area, or at least threaten to. In the nuclear arena, states with nuclear arms have front-burner plans to modernize their forces, particularly the United States and Russia. Former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry recently warned the United States and Russia are on the verge of a new nuclear arms race. Nuclear programs and capabilities continue in unstable countries and volatile regions, particularly, of course, Iran, as we continue to be concerned there, as well as North Korea. And regional conflicts like we see in the Middle East give rise to new nuclear power ambitions. Cyber-related threats loom large, highlighting risk to nuclear facilities, command and control systems, and warning systems, as well as U.S. infrastructure, both public and private. All of these events are occurring while thousands of U.S. and Russian nuclear weapons remain on high alert and thousands more are in global inventories. This underscores the fundamental point that George, Henry, Bill, and I have been making, that reliance on nuclear weapons for our security is becoming increasingly complex and increasingly hazardous. Before we get totally depressed, in analyzing today's complex global security landscape and its implications for nuclear threat reduction, let's look back on the work of George Kennan and Paul Nitze, who in 1947 to 1950 played crucial roles in crafting a U.S. national security strategy that guided American policy throughout the Cold War, more or less followed by both political parties when in office. In their work, they assumed a day when the Cold War would end, though few people then or until the Berlin Wall fell conceded that possibility. But their vision, along with a set of concrete steps pursued by both parties in the White House and our allies, served as an organizing principle for a series of policy initiatives pursued patiently over many years by both political parties. Just as we did not know when and how the Cold War would end, we cannot predict whether and when the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons might be within reach. But a clear U.S. nuclear goal consistent with the Non-Proliferation Treaty obligations is required to guide our policy, give us the high ground, and also guide our diplomacy as well as our defense programs. We do not know what a nuclear weapons-free world would look like, but we do know that it would not be simply today's world subtracting nuclear weapons. There have to be major, major changes. Likewise, there were many changes in the world between 1947 and 1991. But the vision that motivated the policies articulated by Kennan and Nitze was sustained throughout. Both men lived to see the end of the Cold War. Nitze was one of the first to make the case in 1999 for working again toward the elimination of nuclear weapons. With this inspiring example in mind, what are the next steps in nuclear threat reduction? While there is still much to be done, I continue to believe that the vision and steps frame we've been working on with global leaders and experts remains our best hope to address the strategic challenges of a multipolar world while maintaining our own nuclear capabilities in a very sensible way until we reach a different stage in world opinion and willingness to move in this direction. Each step is essential if following generations to ultimately live in a world without nuclear weapons, but each step is also urgently needed if our present generation is going to be able to get the kind of cooperation required to reduce nuclear risk in today's world. For instance, securing all nuclear weapons material globally. If our next president continues to work within this framework, this will also provide needed reinforcement to the non-proliferation and disarmament pillars of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which needs bolstering after a failed review conference last year. Most importantly, a point I keep emphasizing wherever I am in the world leaders must recognize that we are in a new era. Nation states no longer have a monopoly on weapons of mass destruction or disruption, including nuclear, radiological, chemical, biological, as well as cyber. The world is in a race between cooperation and catastrophe. Some relationships are vital. U.S. and Russia relationship is one of those. As the two countries with more than 90% of the world's nuclear inventories, the United States and Russia have a very unique role to play. Trust between our two nations has severely eroded. One of my Russian friends, who is a defense expert, recently posed a powerful question. Vartan and David, this is Alexei Arbatov, you know very well. He said, and he made this a public statement, which I thought was pretty gutsy in Russia's environment today. He said, could President Obama and President Putin today make the same statement that was jointly made by President Reagan and Gorbachev, that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought? I was in Moscow a couple of weeks ago and discussed with both Russians there and Americans back home a few of my own suggestions. I'm going to cite a few of these suggestions today with this audience. My first suggestion, we need to begin to learn how to talk to and about each other. Prominent leaders must realize that reckless rhetoric creates an atmosphere that could lead to dangerous misunderstandings and miscalculations, including throughout the military chain of command. As Henry Kissinger reminded us recently, quoting him, The fate of U.S. and Russia remains tightly intertwined, end quote. Every day, 24/7, our two nations have an existential stake in command and control and warning systems. In both our nations, this must occur every day, all the time. Systems that work perfectly and properly with competent human leadership. We don't stop and think about it. Even some military leaders I've talked to over the years don't think about it. It's not only our warning systems, it's theirs. Theirs have to work, because if they don't work properly, they get false warnings. Awful, terrible catastrophes can happen. Second point, we must revive and strengthen channels of communication with Russia. We can no longer afford to treat dialogue as a bargaining chip. You upset us and we will punish you by not talking is not a sound strategy for two countries that control 90% of the world's nuclear weapons and materials. Both in the Georgia conflict and the Ukrainian conflict, the NATO-Russian Council, which was set up for communication purposes, NATO has refused to have meetings when those conflicts started. To me, why have them if you're not going to have discussions at critical moments? Continuous dialogue is essential between our military leaders and our intelligence communities. The NATO-Russian Council should either be utilized or eliminated, and we need to come up with something else. As a former member of the U.S. Senate, I strongly recommend beginning a dialogue again between our parliamentary leaders as we had during the Cold War. And David, you had a lot to do with that back in those days. As part of this continuous dialogue, the United States, NATO, and Russia must expand mechanisms that reduce the chances of military misunderstandings between us. Last year's events in Turkey relating to the unfortunate shoot-down of the Russian jet serve as a powerful wake-up call that we need to reduce the chances of accidental encounters between NATO aircraft and Russian aircraft, as well as ships at sea. The United States and Russia should also agree on confidence-building measures to reinforce strategic stability and further reduce the chances of miscalculation, including bolstering military-to-military communication. We should also utilize more robustly the nuclear risk reduction centers that former Senator John Warner and I instituted decades ago. They're in existence. They're in the State Department, and they're also in Russia, but they don't do anything like what they should be doing and could be doing. That's another initiative that David Hamburg helped inspire. Third point, effective trust on reducing nuclear risk is not likely when the United States and Russia remain postured for mutually assured destruction in a very brief few minutes. If leaders fail to see and act on this continued danger, Washington and Moscow will remain trapped in a costly and risky nuclear posture, and other nations may follow, making probable that Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not the last cities to suffer a nuclear attack. So Washington and Moscow must find a way to work together to lower prompt launch threats to each side, reduce first strike capabilities, improve the survivability of forces, and increase warning and decision time for leaders. In spite of recent tensions, we should determine if there is a basis for restarting serious discussions with Moscow under this framework. Reducing the number of nuclear weapons is important, but it is only one factor in what we call overall strategic nuclear stability. Fourth, President Obama will host a final nuclear security summit next week, which I mentioned. This is an important opportunity and obligation to build on the progress made at the first three summits to secure weapons-usable nuclear material wherever they are around the globe. Leaders that attend this summit next week must find a way to sustain this effort after President Obama leaves office. The world must develop a global nuclear security system that covers all weapons-usable nuclear materials, including those held for military purposes. We must minimize the risk of nuclear terrorism posed by these materials through actions to reduce and consolidate materials and, wherever possible, eliminate them altogether. Fifth, the President and Congress are facing serious questions about the size and the capability of U.S. nuclear deterrent. We're having very little discussion of it nationally. Leaders must identify trade-offs between paying to maintain and modernize exactly our current nuclear deterrent with all three legs in a triad at an estimated 30-year cost of $1 trillion against investing in other essential defense requirements. Ignoring these trade-offs or resorting to budgetary sleight of hand threatens our non-nuclear defense capabilities over time. The question of how much nuclear is enough with respect to the strategic triad, as well as to what we call tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons, must be asked and answered and linked to our overall defense needs, including conventional forces. Former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry has called recently for a national discussion and debate on this subject, including whether we should phase out our land-based missiles. I believe these important questions raised by Bill Perry must be addressed seriously by the administration and Congress, certainly by the next administration and Congress. Most immediately, and this is something that I think can be achieved, could be achieved in the next week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. No treaties needed, no negotiations or long negotiations, but the United States and Russia, I think, could simply announce that we understand, in spite of our differences, that we must work together in the fight to keep ISIS or other violent extremist groups from getting any type of weapon of mass destruction. The threat posed by ISIS directly affects the core national interest of both of our countries. In particular, Russia and the United States must work to ensure that neither ISIS nor any other violent group ever acquires nuclear, radiological, biological, chemical, or other weapons of mass destruction. I particularly emphasize dirty bomb radiological, which I think is a clear and present danger. Our two countries have the technical expertise and the unique knowledge to lead this effort. We've worked together for since the early 1990s, as has been mentioned. We've been doing such work together as well as in our own countries, now since the Nunn-Lugar program started, early 90s. This mission seems to me to fit well under the legal framework of UN Security Council Resolution 1540, as well as the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism. Most importantly, a joint working group must be formed and must lead by developing a prioritized list of actions that we can take together to prevent catastrophic terrorism. This is urgent and must be a front burner issue with others joining in this effort. Large amounts of radiological material I found out in the last 2 weeks in Russia, according to Russia experts who made a presentation at a 2-day conference. Large amounts of radiological material, not weapons usable, but radiological dirty bomb type, is located all over the STAN countries, which is not very far from where a lot of extremist groups are operating. So this is a proposal that I've talked about in Russia. I've talked about it with our leaders in this government, and I am hopeful that something can be done on that in spite of our huge differences with Russia today. Finally, my final point on U.S.-Russia. When we do work together, as we recently did with the Iran agreement, we must both learn to express our appreciation publicly so that our political leaders, the media, as well as ordinary citizens of both of our countries recognize not just disagreements and confrontations, which is the case today, but also points of mutual interest and areas of success. I sat in a meeting several years ago back in the George W. Bush administration in the Secretary of State's office with former head of Russian Foreign Ministry and other people with almost all the top American officials. And I heard each side talk to each other about all the cooperation that was going on. And it was impressive. Of course, they had disagreements too. When we got to the end, I said, why didn't somebody say this publicly? You know, because I'm worried that the poisonous atmosphere in Russia and the poisonous atmosphere of public opinion here is such that even when leaders want to get together, it's going to be increasingly difficult. That kind of positive dialogue is enormously important. Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov, former foreign minister, who is the present foreign minister's predecessor and mentor, said when I was in Moscow, he made this statement, quote, "We must identify areas where our interests converge, such as combating international terrorism, preventing political extremism, managing migration flows, solving the refugee problem, strengthening cyber and food security, tackling environmental issues, and coordinating on climate change, end quote. I added to that statement in a meeting we had together by saying that if we were going to rebuild damaged trust, the U.S., Russia, and Europe must make every effort to end the Ukrainian conflict in accordance with the Minsk Agreement, which all of us signed up to. In our original Wall Street Journal article, we stated carefully, quoting from that article, that our goal was to reverse reliance on nuclear weapons globally as a vital contribution to preventing their proliferation into dangerous hands and, and ultimately ending them as a threat to the world, end quote. We made it very clear that unless we work together on the actions, the vision cannot be achieved. We and other nuclear powers must also understand that without the ultimate goal or vision, many nations, including our friends around the world, are not likely to support the actions needed to prevent proliferation and catastrophic terrorism. So the two go together, actions and visions. This may be the most difficult but important security mission in the history of the world. I consider the goal of eliminating or getting rid of nuclear weapons like the climbing to the top of a very tall mountain. We can't see the top. We can see that we're heading down, not up. We must turn around. Others must join us as we move together to higher ground. In our world of turmoil and terrorism and distrust, there are many who believe the mountain is too high and the fog is too thick. Many who are complacent argue that we've avoided nuclear catastrophe for more than a half century, so we might as well just keep doing what we've been doing. I disagree. It is human nature to resist change. The status quo often feels safer than change, but the nuclear status quo is a mirage, and the nuclear danger excuse me, is either going to be increasing or being reduced, depending on what we do, we being not just the U.S., but we, U.S., Russia, China, and many other nations. After the first atomic explosion, Einstein commented, "This has changed everything except the thinking of mankind." We explained the decline of other species as too slow to adapt to a changing environment. Mankind must avoid this epitaph. I recharge my batteries frequently by asking myself two questions. If a nuclear disaster occurs, what would we wish we had done to prevent it? Second question, why don't we do it now? Thank you, David Hamburg.
Senator Nunn will take questions. You'll have to speak up loudly, and we'd ask that there's a mic here and here, but ask you not to make a particular statement, but a crisp question, please.
Senator, thank you for those very important remarks. What policy prescriptions would you offer for dealing with the nuclear threat posed by North Korea?
Well, I am co-chairing a task force right now with Admiral Mike Mullen on that very question. And we've had 2 meetings. We've got another one coming up next week. I think the key, and a lot of people have said this, non-original thought, is China. China is the country with a relationship with North Korea. They are the ones that have trade with them. It's a very important thing that we keep North Korea from developing not only the nuclear weapons inventory, they already have nuclear weapons, but also the missile capability. And of course, there have been all sorts of UN resolutions passed. I think we've got to be very clear with China, our expectations, and I think our government is doing that now, so that's not an original thought. I also think we need to sit down with China and sit down and have very quiet discussions with them about what would happen if North Korea collapses. Because China fears the collapse of North Korea more than they fear their nuclear weapons. They don't want them to have nuclear weapons, but they fear that collapse. They fear millions of refugees. They fear destabilization of their borders. There are a lot of fears that we probably don't even completely understand. They also fear U.S. troops moving to their border, and they fear South Korea-U.S. alliance being on the China border. we've got to discuss those things with them. So on the one hand, getting firmer with China in a private, diplomatic way, but also listening to them and understanding from them their concerns about it. Because if you're not willing for North Korea to collapse, you can't put the squeeze on it has to be put on. And South Korea, depending on the government there, they have some of the same fears. South Koreans realize that if North Korea does collapse because of economic sanctions or destabilization, that they've got huge, huge problems. The other factor that has to be put into the equation is the fact that even without nuclear weapons, North Korea poses an existential threat to the capital city of South Korea. For years, they've had thousands of artillery tubes sitting within 30-mile range of the South Korean capital, the head of their basic whole economic miracle. And so they pose that threat if there is a war. Now, any war, I haven't been briefed in a long time on this one, but any war, in my opinion, just roughly speaking, would be decisively in South Korea, U.S. favor. And it would happen within several weeks. But if you lose the South Korean capital and you have millions of refugees from South Korea as well as North, is something you want to avoid if you possibly can. So that would be my approach. Some of that may be going on. I'm not privy to what may be going on. I'm hoping it is. But I would say that there's a positive step that's recently been taken by the UN Security Council, and China had to go along with it. And that is, they basically now have a UN Security Council resolution which empowers states to search every ship or plane coming out of North Korea. What I've always worried about with North Korea, Iran is a different picture. I worry about proliferation with other countries of Iran as well as their own. But in North Korea, they're so desperately poor and the economic system is such a basket case, I worry about the sale of weapons, usable nuclear material to terrorist groups because they are desperate for funding. That's where the worry is. So this UN resolution, which the question is whether it will be actually implemented by countries, including China, but it does help address that problem of preventing the sale of nuclear materials by North Korea. Yes, sir.
As a former member of the Armed Service Committee, do you think it's even possible that we will give up land-based missiles, which Bill Perry is talking about, which I think could be a very important step forward, but is it even feasible or possible?
I'd say today, if you voted on it, it would be overwhelmingly no, I think. But I think if you see over the next 2 years a debate occur and people start really wondering about whether we can pay for all this and what does it do to the U.S. Navy budget, what does it do to the U.S. Army budget, we've got to rebuild the Army. They've had impressive 12, 14 years of constant battles in Afghanistan and Iraq. And what does it do to the U.S. Air Force budget? And when you look at the forces we're going to use, and you look at the other big question has to come, and again, I'm not completely up to date on this one, but what is the vulnerability of land-based missiles? And right now, they're very vulnerable. And of course, we've had all sorts of morale problems with missile command and control and silos. We've had a lot of problems there. I think the whole question has to be carefully examined. But I think Bill raises the point that the debate hasn't even occurred. And we're setting in motion right now under President Obama's administration, we're setting in motion a modernization of all three legs of the triad: bombers, submarines, and land-based missiles. The total cost is projected to be about $1 trillion over a 30-year period. Now, when you look at the personnel cost, retirement cost, medical cost, and you take that cost and you add that to the budget, and then you look at another $1 trillion coming in the next on just nuclear, you got to ask what is America's forces that are going to be used, more likely used, doing? And then the all-important question: can we survive a first strike? This is what stability is all about. Could we survive a first strike with just the bombers and the submarines? So the vulnerability of submarines is very, very important here. So in a year or two after we really examine this situation, I think it's the Armed Services Committee on both the House and Senate are going to have to look at the trade-offs. It's not simply one easy question. A lot of trade-offs here. And also, I think the attitude of the Russians is important too. I mean, if we start working with the Russians on some of these nuclear questions, as I've outlined in my remarks, it'd be a little bit different view than right now. Right now, with the Russians, in my view, making irresponsible statements about nuclear weapons, it would be a very difficult environment. But the questions have to be asked. Yes, sir.
Thanks for your existential work, and thanks for being here. Question, can you address, as you did for North Korea, Pakistan?
Well, Pakistan is an ally, though if you look at the polls in Pakistan, America is very distrusted by their population. We're also distrusted by their military. So we, I'm sure, over the last two administrations, both Bush administration and Obama administration, have sent our military people over there over and over and over again, trying to assure the Pakistanis are properly safeguarding their nuclear weapons as well as their nuclear materials. They are very antsy about the U.S. Having access to any of those sites. So I would say that we don't have complete assurances. And what I worry about Pakistan, to me, it may be one of the most dangerous countries in the world because they have nuclear weapons, they have nuclear materials, and they also have violent extremist groups. And so what you worry about is also insiders. What about the insiders in Pakistan? So I worry a lot about Pakistan. I know that we're doing what we can do there. But India and Pakistan, in my view, also is the area of the world where I'd be most concerned about some type of conflict with nuclear weapons breaking out. You've got two countries that have had historical animosities. You've got religious differences. You've got violent extremism. You've got conflict over Kashmir. You've got question of, this is where cyber comes in. At some point, U.S. and Russia need to work together on cyber, making sure that command and control is not in any way threatened. If we ever do that, if we ever got to that point where we could work together on common threats to our own command and control and warning systems, then certainly it would be in both of our interests to help share it with India and Pakistan and try to make sure they don't have an accidental war. There was an article in Scientific American magazine about 2.5 years ago that caught my eye because it was a hypothetical supercomputer run on the basis of 100 weapons being exploded between India and Pakistan, a war there limited to those two countries. And they both have far more weapons than that. And the result would be several 100 million people killed immediately, but even more devastating to the world, the global cooling that would take place by the blockage of the sun with that many weapons going off would result, according to this article, a 1.5 billion, 2 billion people starving over the next decade. So when people say that everything's a sovereign right, a sovereign right, a sovereign right to have nuclear weapons, to have nuclear enrichment and so forth, not the way I think. I think no country has the right to impose that kind of devastation on the globe. And the whole world has a stake in this. Yes, sir, way back.
Yes, we were successful for many years in entering into reductions from the 10,000 plus nuclear weapons with Russia down to the 3,000 level. What is your view as to why that has not continued, since we all know that that level is vastly in excess of any of the other countries and what's needed from a security perspective? So what is your view as to the politics and the military issues as to why that process after like 3 or 4 rounds has ceased?
Well, there are some legitimate concerns, and then there are other concerns that both the U.S. and Russia have with each other that interferes with the counter-political relationship. One of the genuine concerns is that I think at some point U.S. and Russia would both feel that other countries with nuclear weapons have to be part of the discussion, even though they may not be part of the next round of cuts. But the other countries, as I mentioned, with the United States and Russia still having several thousand weapons each, are not ready to have that discussion. At some point, China has to get involved in the discussion, as well as our allies Britain and France. And also, we got countries like India and Pakistan that are building up their weapons. So at some point, this becomes more than just a bilateral type relationship. But the immediate reason that we've got no discussions going on with the U.S. and Russia is because of the Ukrainian situation. The United States and Russia and Great Britain assured Ukraine, and they gave up their nuclear weapons in the early 1990s, that we would all assure them of the backing for their sovereignty. I'm not sure of the exact magic words. It was not a defense commitment, but it was certainly an expression of solidarity on the sovereignty of Ukraine. And of course, that's been badly breached by the Russians. And so all of those things play into it. The political relationships simply have not been strong enough and are not now to sustain that kind of serious arms control negotiation. This is one of the reasons I'm trying to advocate building the bridge to at least have a working group working together to keep weapons of mass destruction out of the hands of terrorist group, including but not limited to ISIL. That's a bridge that would encompass an awful lot of cooperation. But we have to have better political relationships before we're going to have those kind of arms control discussions. I would like to see, really, I think we're at the stage where if it were me, I would rather focus on increased warning time than I would numbers of weapons. What you really, when you talk about strategic stability, what I mean by that, I'm not sure everybody means the same thing, but I mean by that not having force postures that would lead either U.S. or Russia to believe that a first strike would be in their national security interest. It is not in our view, in our interest for the Russians to fear a first strike and therefore be prepared to launch on warning, launching their forces because they're not confident they can survive a first strike. We need to talk about those things. Those are the kind of things that really you need to get military leaders talking about together. It's not the kind of thing you sit down and write 2 or 3 sentences and say presto. But strategic stability, in my view, is more important than exactly the number of weapons. Survivability of weapons is the assurance against a first strike succeeding. It's in our interest for the Russians to have survivable forces. If we ever get to that stage where we have confidence that neither of us is going to have a first strike against the other, then the numbers will begin to come down. Numbers will become less relevant. But all of those things have to enter into the discussion. I know it sounds like Dr. Strangelove, but that's the way the military leaders have to think. What you don't want to do is have a military general in Moscow come up to Putin or any other president and say, Mr. President, I hate to tell you, but you got 3 to 5 minutes to either use your nuclear weapons or we may lose them because we think there's a first strike coming in. We think there is. That's what you call launch on warning, launch before they actually hit. That can be a mistake. In a cyber world, it can be a terrible mistake. In a world where you have submarines owned by not just U.S. and Russia, by others, it could be an unidentified attack, not U.S., but guess who would pay the price? It would be both of us. And of course, Russia knows that if they launch attack against us, we can survive and retaliate. But that's small consolation that we could destroy them in exchange. We've got to have a meeting of the minds on this. We're riding a nuclear tiger that made sense during the Cold War to some extent, because during the Cold War there was an existential philosophical difference about the way we basically saw the world. But today, we should not be in this posture. We ought to move away from that kind of prompt launch posture, and it can be done. It just takes hard work and a lot of discussion among military leaders. Okay. Yes, sir.
Could you offer your view on the U.S. Senate, your former body you served in's ability to tackle these issues this time?
There are some serious people, good people in the Senate. I don't want in any way to disparage the institution as a whole. It's still a body I love very much, but they're having a very hard time, getting along well enough to even make the committees function properly. This ought to be the subject of a lot of hearings, some of them closed, top secret hearings in committees. And they have some of those. I don't want you to believe they don't have any, but it's awfully hard for them to work together now. When I was in the Senate, Bob Dole and Robert Byrd, nobody's a more avid Republican than Bob Dole, and Robert Byrd was an avid Democrat. But those two leaders Ted Stevens and I went to them and we said, we think an arms control observer group would be great. And they not only endorsed that concept, they went to Geneva with us and they went to Vienna with us where arms control discussions were going on. We had about 6 or 8 Republicans and 6 or 8 Democrats, and the 2 leaders actually went. So the leadership makes all the difference in the world, and we don't have that kind of leadership in the Senate today. We just don't have it. There are some individual members who would be perfectly capable of that kind of cooperation. Saxby Chambliss, who was from my state, and Mark Warner from Virginia, Democrat and Republican. They worked assiduously on the budget fiscal situation, which is also a huge challenge. But they had no leadership backing whatsoever. So I would say that we have a long way to go. I don't in any way, I take a long-term pessimistic view, though. I think America finds ways to make things work. Now, we're in a period now that's pretty bad in terms of cooperation. One problem, though, and I don't have an answer to this problem given the Supreme Court decisions, the Senate of the United States, like the House of Representatives, are so busy raising money that it's not, you know, people think of it as being you're bought. You give me $100 or $1,000 and I'm going to do your bidding. Maybe that's a problem. Maybe that's too much pressure and leverage. But the big problem is intellectual corruption. By corruption, I mean not having the time to spend on important subjects. Not having the time. If you stay in a session, you get in there Monday afternoon or Tuesday morning and you leave Thursday afternoon and you're raising money, probably 2 fundraisers every week while you're there, and then you have fundraisers and you're going to California, you're going to New York, you're going all over creation. You don't get to know your colleagues and you don't get time to get into these subjects in depth. I don't know when the last time they've had a strategic stability type of real debate or discussion in a committee or on the floor of the Senate, maybe behind closed doors, I don't know. But these are crucial discussions. And this is one of the things, and Vartan, I wanted to report to you, I've had a couple of conversations with Republican members of either Armed Services or Foreign Relations, and there seems to be some willingness to restore that kind of U.S.-Russian Duma parliamentary discussions. I think it's very important. But right now, the leaders in Russia that we would be dealing with, if we had that, are part of they're under sanctions. We couldn't meet with them in foreign countries, and some of ours are under sanctions. So U.S. and Russia are playing this tit-to-tat game that nobody can say is in the interest of either country, but that's the game that's being played right now. And there are reasons behind it. I mean, I don't want to make light of what the Russians have done in the Ukraine because it's very destabilizing in that part of the world. We also, I'll make my final comment here, we also need we're not going to get it in track one being government to government. We need a track 2 Euro-Atlantic leadership group. Europeans, Russians, and U.S. These would be former officials, people at high levels that have access, that begin to discuss Euro-Atlantic security in the long run. What role does Russia want to play in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years? I've said in several talks and interviews in Russia, how is it in Russia's interest to have all your neighbors frightened? I mean, how does that make sense? It makes no sense for Russia. And, you know, how does it make sense for the United States and NATO to expand our borders and deploy military forces right next to the Russian border, knowing they already, you know, they're paranoid historically about that kind of thing. And we would be too if the situation was reversed. You remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we're doing things in reaction to each other that if you back off of, and you really don't make sense for either country's security. And therefore, these kind of discussions are important. Whether this will happen or not, whether I can ever come to you and say to Carnegie, it's time to go back to sponsoring that kind of dialogue between U.S. and Russian members of their respective parliaments, I don't know. But anyway, it needs to be done. Thank you very much, and thank you for your interest in foreign policy.